Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the scariest stories from around the web. Today, we've scoured Reddit to bring you the spookiest ghost stories we could find. From haunted houses to creepy encounters in the woods, these stories will send shivers down your spine. Number 1. During our camping trip to a remote lake in New Mexico with my husband's family, we encountered a bizarre incident. It was nighttime, and we were indulging in typical camping activities like making s'mores, having a few drinks, and sharing stories when we all heard a little girl yelling out for help. Despite the fact that there were no children in either group, we were all certain that we heard a little girl crying for help. We decided to join forces and explore the area from where the cries were coming. Behind our campsite was a vast field, and as we approached it, we saw a towering, pure white figure standing about 100 feet away, creating the noise. We all agreed that the creature appeared to be about 6 feet tall, skinny, and completely white. As we advanced, the strange figure began to retreat and quickly disappeared into the forest. All night, we heard the cries of a little girl, and it was difficult to sleep because of the unsettling experience we had just encountered. Number 2. When I was 16 years old, my mother, my sister, who was 20 years old at the time, and I embarked on a road trip across the country. We were well rested and alert, even though it was late. We were driving along an interstate, and we needed to stop for gas and a bathroom break, so we pulled over at the only rest stop in 200 miles. As we arrived, everything felt off. We had been on the road for days and had stopped at many rest stops at night, but we had never felt scared until then. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked in front of us with 2 young men standing motionless outside of it. While my mother and sister went inside, I stayed in the car. I overheard the teenagers saying that they were scared and couldn't get the pump to work, so they left in a hurry. As I watched the car in front of us, the 2 men didn't move at all. They weren't talking or on their phones. They were just standing there like statues. Suddenly, my sister and mother came running back to the car, and as they got in, the 2 men slowly turned to look at us without moving the rest of their bodies. We all saw the same thing. Their eyes were as dark as pitch and completely empty. They didn't reflect any light at all, just a void. We hastily drove away from the rest stop and didn't stop until we reached the next city. The most unsettling part of the experience was that we couldn't find the place on any map. We knew the exact location on the interstate, but we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station on that stretch of road, but they just looked confused. We've traveled on that interstate many times since then, but there's no rest stop at that location. Number 3. We were out for a late-night drive through a sprawling graveyard in my friend's old and beat-up Subaru. As we drove along, we spotted a small pond down a hill and decided to take a closer look. On the other side of the pond, we saw a figure sitting on a rock. The figure was all black, and we couldn't make out any features other than a top hat. Without thinking, we shouted a greeting to the figure and waved our hands. But there was no response. The figure just sat there motionless on the rock. Suddenly, the figure jumped up and started running towards us, running on the water. But halfway across the pond, it vanished into thin air. We were terrified and ran back to the car, screaming. We tried to start the car, but it wouldn't start. To make matters worse, we heard banging sounds on the back of the car, but we couldn't see anything in the dark. We all tried to call for help, but none of our phones had any signal. We were stranded and helpless, with only the occasional banging to keep us company. After about 30 minutes, we managed to start the car, and we drove away as fast as we could. As soon as we left the graveyard, our phones miraculously regained their signal. We knew for sure that there was something out there with us, something that was not human or animal. Number 4. When I was 37, I decided to attend my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car to drive the 35 miles to the event. The route took me through a remote and almost deserted area. Along the way, I saw someone on the side of the road waving for me to stop. I pulled over and was surprised to see that it was one of my old classmates from school, Jim. We hadn't seen each other in 2 decades, but he looked just the same as I remembered him, maybe a bit older. Jim got in the car, and we started chatting about old times. When we arrived in town, I suggested we grab a drink at the VVU, but he declined, saying he just wanted to go home. I assumed his parents still lived in the same area and began driving in that direction. But then he told me to take him to the outskirts of town, to a mobile home park. When we arrived at the end of the road, he asked me to drop him off and said it was nice to see me again before disappearing into the night. Later that night, at the reunion, I mentioned to my former classmates that I had seen Jim earlier that evening. To my surprise, everyone fell silent. It turned out that Jim had died 8 years prior in a car accident on that very road. I felt dizzy and went outside to take some deep breaths in my car. There on the seat was a local newspaper from 8 years ago, containing Jim's obituary. I couldn't believe it. It was a chilling experience that I will never forget. Number 5. When my family moved into our new home, we were informed that a woman had been killed there by her abusive husband. According to the story, she despised men. However, strange things began happening once we moved in. My dad would frequently wake up with scratches all over his body, and if my brother was ever unkind to my sister or me, he too would end up with scratches. Then, one day, my brother went too far and physically hurt our sister. Later that night, he woke up with a terrible bloody nose. The unsettling events continued until the day we moved out. On that last night in the house, my brother accidentally broke his twin's arm while trying out a wrestling move. He firmly believes that if we had stayed in that house any longer, something far worse could have happened. Number 6. Number 6. As my dad lay in his bed, battling stage 4 esophageal cancer, I stood by his side trying to comfort him. Suddenly, I felt a strange sensation behind me. Turning around, I saw a black figure about 4'6" tall with its hands on the doorframe, peeking around the corner from the living room. I rushed towards it, but it quickly disappeared back into the living room. I searched the area but found nothing. When I returned to my dad's room and shared my experience with him, he was understandably confused. However, as his final days approached, other visitors to our house claimed to have seen the same figure. Even my mother had witnessed the apparition on multiple occasions, in different parts of the house. But after my dad's passing, we never saw it again. Despite my experiences, I still find myself drawn to true ghost stories on Reddit, even though every place I've lived seems to have its own resident spirit. Number 7. As a teenager, I lived with my mother after my parents' divorce, and during that time, I experienced a lot of strange things. One thing that happened repeatedly was the room I was in suddenly feeling very cold, followed by an intense feeling of being watched by something that hated me. Whenever I felt this way, I would leave the room and return later when the feeling had passed. Sometimes during the day, I would see a shadow figure creeping along the walls of my bedroom. One day, I heard a deep growl coming from under my bed, but when I looked, there was nothing there except for my dog. It was strange because the growl was much deeper than any noise my dog was capable of making. Another time, my dog was whimpering and pacing in the room next to mine, but wouldn't come when I called him, as if he was afraid of something in the hallway. I was convinced that something in our flat was pretending to be my dog or was tormenting us in some other way. However, when I moved in with my father, all the paranormal activity stopped, which was a huge relief. Number 8. When I got married shortly after college, my wife and I had to move into a basement apartment because it was the only place we could afford. Little did we know that the apartment came with an unwelcome resident, a poltergeist. My wife was terrified of whatever was living there with us. The ghost made it clear that it wanted to live alone by throwing dishes, glasses, and other items off the shelves. My wife was hit several times, and there was always an ominous feeling like we were being watched. At night, as we walked through the apartment in the dark, insanely bright flashes of light would suddenly illuminate the entire room. But the worst experience was when we heard a voice from nowhere while we were getting ready to go to bed. The voice said, "Move." My wife and I looked at each other, shocked. Without hesitation, I said, "You've got it, bud." We packed our bags and moved out 2 days later, staying with family instead. A few months later, the old lady who owned the apartment died, and the house was eventually torn down. Now it's just an empty lot with nothing but grass and a tree. Although we moved out, I still drive by it every now and again, wondering what would have happened if we had stayed. Number 9. When my dad was working as a corrections officer at a rural prison, he had a strange experience that he could never explain. His job was to drive around the property all night, checking empty buildings for any runaway inmates. One night, he parked his truck on a hill and started reading a magazine. Suddenly, he felt a heavy thumping sensation in his body, as if the speakers were playing a song with really heavy bass. When he looked in his rearview mirror, he saw someone outside the truck. He grabbed his pistol and jumped out of the truck, ready to defend himself. But to his surprise, he saw a procession of Native Americans walking straight through the truck and through his seat. They looked like ghosts, and many of them appeared to be injured. The procession went on for a few seconds, and then suddenly disappeared. My dad was shaken and called the other perimeter guy on his walkie-talkie to tell him what happened. However, the other guy had seen the same thing before, but refused to talk about it, as he didn't believe in ghosts. From that night on, my dad drove around the perimeter with a little more caution and always kept his eyes peeled for anything strange. Number 10. As a forensic nurse working in a hospital's lockup unit, I encountered a patient who claimed she was being haunted and abused by a demon named Tiberius. The woman, an older lady, experienced a lot of unusual occurrences during her stay in the unit. Every time we left the room after providing care, she would start screaming in agony, and when we returned, we found her with bruises, black eyes, and markings all over her body. We could never find any evidence that she was doing it to herself, and things in the room would sometimes move on their own. At one point, we had to put her in protective restraints because the doctor believed she was harming herself. However, we still found new marks on her or her tray cart in different positions, even though she couldn't have done it herself while in restraints. When we asked her what happened, she simply replied, "It was Tiberius." Even after the woman was discharged, we continued to experience strange things in that room. It became the location of rapid responses and codes. One night, a guard reported seeing lights blinking on and off, and they were coming from that very same room. It was clear that something paranormal was going on in there. All right. Reddit is full of terrifying stories like this one. Who knows what other ghostly encounters are waiting to be discovered in the depths of the internet?